the sinister tale of Civil War soldiers, what they uncovered in the barren wilderness of the Appalachians. The mist clung to the sharp peaks like a damp shroud, refusing to let the morning sun reach the valley floor. Before we get into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're tuning in from, what city, which state, what country. We love knowing who's out here with us tonight. Now, let's head back to 1865. The Appalachian Mountains in March of 1865 were a place where the Civil War's echoes started to fade into a far older, much deeper silence of the earth. The great conflict was bleeding toward its inevitable end in the lowlands, but up here, along the borderlands of West Virginia and Tennessee, the North-South struggles felt like children's petty squabbles compared to the ancient, indifferent weight of the stone and timber. Sergeant Elias Croft guided his small four-man detachment through a landscape that seemed to have forgotten civilization ever existed. At 38, Croft was a man forged in the fires of Antietam and Gettysburg. His face was a map of scars and weariness, his eyes hardened into flint. He bore the heavy burden of command not with pride, but with a grim, practiced necessity, knowing his men's survival depended entirely on his ability to stay unmoved by the wilderness's encroaching shadows. The air was thick with damp pine and the sharp, metallic tang of an approaching storm. Trudging behind Croft was Private Thomas Hale, a 19-year-old boy from Pennsylvania's rural pastures who looked as though he had aged 10 years in the last 3 weeks. Hale was the group's heart, or what remained of it, still holding a sliver of the innocence the war had tried so hard to extinguish. He was a son of the soil, a farmhand who understood the language of crops and seasons. Yet as they pushed deeper into the dense thickets of the high ridges, he found himself unable to read this place's omens. He was the first to notice that the birds had stopped singing miles ago. The forest's usual chatter, the scolding of squirrels, the rustle of small game had been replaced by an oppressive, heavy stillness, as if the very atmosphere were holding its breath. To their left, Corporal Silas Webb kept a steady, rhythmic pace, his mind clearly elsewhere. A former Ohio schoolteacher, Webb was 34 and viewed the world through the cold, unyielding lens of rationalism. Even in the midst of a brutal war, he had clung to his books and his logic, convinced that any mystery of the universe could be unraveled with enough observation and intellect. He adjusted his spectacles, perpetually clouded by mountain humidity, and muttered about the limestone cliffs' geological composition surrounding them. For Webb, the unease hanging over the squad was merely the result of fatigue, malnutrition, and the psychological strain of a long campaign. He dismissed the creeping dread as a simple biological reaction to isolation, a theory he shared loudly whenever the silence grew too heavy to bear. Bringing up the rear was Jedediah "Jed" Monroe. Jed was a man of shadows, a Southerner who had once worn Confederate gray before deserting and finding his way into the Union ranks. He knew the Appalachians in a way the others never could, having been raised in the dark hollows and forgotten gaps of the Southern range. He carried his people's superstitions and folklore like a second skin. While Webb looked at the rocks and Croft looked at the trail, Jed looked at the gaps between the trees. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace, his fingers often tracing the air as if feeling for a change in the wind. He spoke the least but saw the most, and as they ascended into the higher altitudes where the hemlocks grew tall and black, his hand stayed perpetually near his rifle's hammer. The march into the darkness of the gorge was slow and grueling. The terrain was a labyrinth of deep ravines and treacherous, rain-slicked slopes that threatened to snap a man's ankle with every misstep. The fog did not lift as the day progressed. Instead, it seemed to thicken, swirling around their legs like a living thing, obscuring the ground and distorting their sense of distance. Croft felt a prickling on the back of his neck, a phantom heat suggesting eyes were fixed on them from the high ridges above. He didn't speak of it, maintaining a soldier's rigid discipline, but he noticed that even the wind had a different quality here. It didn't howl so much as whisper, a low, sibilant sound that mimicked human speech's cadence. By After noon, the squad reached the banks of a narrow, churning mountain river. The water was black and ice-cold, fed by the melting snows of the higher peaks. As they paused to refill their canteens, Hale let out a sharp, stifled gasp. He pointed toward a soft patch of dark silt at the water's edge. There, pressed deep into the mud, were a series of tracks. They were not a bear's prints, nor a soldier's boots' heavy, treaded marks. They were wide, elongated impressions with a terrifyingly large gap between the toes and a total lack of a human heel structure. They emerged from the water and led straight into an impenetrable wall of rhododendron thickets, as though something had walked calmly out of the depths and disappeared into the brush. Croft knelt by the prints, his heart thudding against his ribs. The tracks were fresh, the water still seeping into the depressions. They were being watched, not by a lingering enemy scout, but by something that belonged to the mountains themselves. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The sinister tale of Civil War soldiers, what they uncovered in the barren wilderness of the Appalachians. Before we get into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're tuning in from, what city, which state, what country. We love knowing who's out here with us tonight. Now let's head back to 1865. The silence following the discovery of the tracks was more deafening than any cannon fire Sergeant Elias Croft had ever endured. He stood slowly, his joints protesting against the damp mountain air, and looked toward the wall of green where the strange impressions vanished. There was no rustle of leaves, no snapping of twigs, just a heavy, stagnant peace that felt entirely artificial. He could see the pulse hammering in Private Hale's neck, the young man's skin turning a waxy, sickly pale. Croft offered no words of comfort. In this wilderness, comfort was a lie that could get a man killed. He simply signaled for the squad to shoulder their packs and move away from the water. They climbed upward, leaving the Black River behind, but the sensation of being observed did not fade. It felt as though the very trees were leaning in, their gnarled branches reaching out to snag the wool of their tattered blue uniforms. As the afternoon light began to fail, bleeding into a bruised purple hue behind the heavy clouds, the squad crested a jagged limestone ridge and found themselves staring down into a hidden hollow. Nestled in the center of a small, bowl-shaped valley were the remains of a settlement. It was a cluster of perhaps 6 or 7 log cabins, their timber grayed and skeletal from years of exposure. These were not the charred ruins of a war-torn village. There were no scorch marks from Confederate torches, nor signs of a siege. Instead, the buildings looked as if they had simply been surrendered to the earth. Roofs had collapsed under winter snows, and thick, strangling ivy vines had wound themselves through the windows like a drowning man's fingers. The air here was colder, trapped by the surrounding cliffs, and carried a faint, cloying scent of wet ash and stagnant water. Croft led them down the slope with his rifle leveled. Every step was a gamble against the treacherous, loose stone. When they reached the clearing's perimeter, Corporal Silas Webb immediately broke formation to inspect a hand-carved wooden bucket left sitting on a porch. It was half filled with rainwater and dead insects, but the wood was not yet fully rotted. Webb pushed his spectacles up the bridge of his nose, his analytical mind struggling to reconcile the object's state with the oppressive atmosphere. He noted a child's rag doll lying in the dirt, its button eyes missing, and a heavy iron kettle still hanging over a cold hearth. To Webb, it looked like a sudden exodus, a community that had fled in the middle of a meal, leaving behind precious survival tools. He began to murmur about a possible smallpox outbreak or a sudden threat from a marauding band of bushwhackers, his voice trembling slightly as he sought a logical anchor for the scene. Jedediah Monroe, however, did not look at the tools. He walked to the largest cabin's doorframe and stopped, his eyes fixed on the lintel. There, deep gouges had been carved into the wood, strange, interlocking geometric patterns resembling stars with too many points. Jed's face went grim, his weathered features hardening into a mask of recognition. He moved from cabin to cabin, finding the same symbols etched over every entrance and even into the ancient oak's bark standing guard over the clearing. These were not illiterate man's markings. They were Ward's ancient protection sigils used by those who lived so far from God's light that they had to invent their own ways to keep the darkness at bay. Jed traced the lines with a shaking finger, whispering a prayer in a dialect the others couldn't quite follow. He knew these signs meant the people here hadn't been running from a disease. They had been trying to bar the door against something that didn't need a key. Despite the obvious omens, the sun was disappearing fast, and the mountain fog was rolling in like a thick white tide. To stay in the open would be suicide in this terrain. Croft made the executive decision to hole up in the most intact cabin, a structure that felt slightly more solid than the others. They moved inside, the floorboards groaning under their boots like a living thing in pain. The interior was a tomb of shadows. Dust danced in the weak light of their single lantern, settling on a table where a crust of bread had long since turned to stone. The windows were small and narrow, offering little view of the encroaching night. Croft assigned watches, placing Hale by the door and Webb by the rear window, while Jed sat in the center of the room, his eyes closed, his lips moving in a silent, frantic rhythm. The night brought transformation to the Appalachians. The wind didn't just blow, it seemed to mourn, whistling through the gaps in the logs with a sound mimicking a human flute. Hours passed in a tense, vibrating silence until Thomas Hale suddenly stiffened. He leaned his head against the door, his eyes wide with a terror that bypassed reason. He gestured for the others to listen. At first, there was nothing but the wind, but then, rising from the wood's darkness, came a sound that chilled Croft to his very marrow. It wasn't a roar or a predator's cry. It was a voice low, rhythmic, and impossibly deep. It hummed a repetitive pattern, a series of guttural vibrations felt in the chest rather than heard in the ears. It was chanting, ancient and hypnotic, coming from every direction at once. Silas Webb tried to speak, his mouth opening to suggest it was the wind rushing through a hollow log or a trick of the mountain's acoustics, but the words died in his throat. The chanting grew louder, a steady, pulsing cadence seeming to count the seconds of their lives. It was the sound of the Watcher, the ridge's guardian, acknowledging their presence. They sat in the dark, rifles gripped so tightly their knuckles turned white, watching the door as the rhythmic humming vibrated through the cabin's very foundations. They didn't sleep, they didn't even dare breathe heavily. They simply waited for the dawn, wondering if the door's wards would be enough to keep the singer outside. The darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It had become a weight, a physical entity pressing against the walls, testing the rotted wood's strength and the four trapped men's resolve. The gray dawn did not bring light so much as it diluted the heavy shadows of the long night. The rhythmic chanting had ceased exactly 4 minutes before the first hint of sun touched the high ridges, leaving a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight against the eardrums. Sergeant Elias Croft sat by the door, his eyes bloodshot, his rifle still resting across his weary knees. He had not blinked in what felt like hours, his senses strained to the breaking point. Beside him, Private Thomas Hale was a ghost of a man, his youthful face pinched and aged by the dark hours' terror. They had survived the night, but as visibility slowly increased, the realization set in that the cabin offered no true sanctuary. The air remained stagnant, smelling of wet cedar, old ash, and the cold, metallic tang of human fear. Croft stood up, his joints popping like dry kindling in the absolute stillness. "Check your gear," he commanded, his voice raspy and thin. The simple military routine was a tether to reality, a way to reclaim their identity as soldiers. But as the men began to inspect their kits, that tether snapped. Corporal Silas Webb, who had spent the night muttering formulas and logical proofs to himself, let out a sharp, strangled gasp. His haversack, which he had used as a makeshift pillow, was no longer under his head. It sat 3 feet away, perfectly upright in the center of the dusty floorboards. He had not felt it move, nor heard a single rustle of fabric during his long, wide-eyed vigil. "I didn't touch it," Hale whispered, backing away from the bag as if it were a coiled viper ready to strike. "I didn't move an inch, Sergeant. I swear by the Almighty, I didn't close my eyes for a second." Croft did not answer immediately. He walked over to his own pack, which had been leaned against the far wall. His tin cup, which had been tied securely to the leather strap with a double knot, was now resting on the table next to a piece of petrified bread. The knot had not been cut. It had been untied with surgical precision and left in a perfect coil on the wood. The cold that seeped into Croft's bones then was not from the mountain air. It was the realization that while they had been staring at the door and windows, something had been inside the room with them, moving between their very breaths. Jedediah Monroe did not join the equipment check. He was staring at the wall behind the cold hearth. His face was the color of wood ash. "Sergeant," he said, his voice a mere thread of sound, "look at the chimney." Croft approached the wall, holding his breath. There, etched into the soot-stained wood of the interior chimney breast, was the same interlocking star symbol they had seen on the outside lintels. It was fresh. The wood shavings were still pale and bright against the darkened timber. Jed had inspected this very wall the night before while looking for drafts to block. It had been bare, smooth, and untouched. "It is a claim," Jed whispered, his eyes darting to the shadowed corners. "It is not just to keep things out anymore. It is to mark what is already inside. We have been counted, Sergeant." Silas Webb's rationalism, already brittle, began to shatter like glass. He began to pace the small room, his boots thudding unevenly. "It was one of us," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "The stress of the campaign triggers dormant psychological states. One of us moved the items in a fugue. One of us carved that mark in a fit of deluded hysteria. It is the only logical explanation for such a localized phenomenon." Jedediah did not even look at him. "I do not carry a knife that sharp, Silas," he countered, "and neither do you. Look at the depth of the groove. That was not done by a man shivering in the dark." Croft did not let the argument escalate. "Enough, we are leaving. Pack the rations. We move out now." They shouldered their packs, the weight feeling twice as heavy as the day before. Croft led them out of the cabin and into the swirling white curtain of the morning mist. The atmosphere was oppressive, the fog clinging to their wool coats like damp hands. They moved toward the slope they had descended the previous evening, intending to backtrack to the river. But as they reached the clearing's edge, Croft stopped. He checked his compass, but the needle spun lazily, refusing to settle. He searched for the jagged limestone outcrop that had served as their landmark. It was gone. Where there should have been a steep, rocky incline and traces of their own footprints, there was only a wall of impenetrable rhododendron and ancient, gnarled laurel. The forest had closed behind them like a wound healing in an instant. The path was gone. The very topography of the mountain seemed to have shifted, the ridges folding in on themselves to create a labyrinth with no exit. "The trail," Hale started, his voice cracking. "Sergeant, where is the trail?" Webb scrambled forward, his hands clawing at the thick, waxy leaves. "It has to be here. Erosion or perhaps a small landslide during the night must have covered it. The mist is distorting our perception." He was hyperventilating, his fingers trembling as he tried to find a gap in the vegetation. There was none. The growth was dense and seemingly decades old. They were trapped in the hollow, held fast by a geography that refused to obey nature's laws. They retreated to the settlement's center, standing in a circle as the mist pressed in closer, erasing the cabins. It was then that Jedediah Monroe sat down on a rotted stump. He looked at the others with weary resignation. "You want to know what is happening, Silas? My granddaddy told me about this place. He called it the Watcher's Ground." Croft leaned against a porch railing. "Tell us, Jed, no more riddles." Jed began to speak, staring into the fog. "The folks who lived here did not leave because of the war. They left because the Watcher of the Ridges grew tired of their noise. It is not a ghost. It is the mountain itself given a shape and age." Mind, it does not hunt for meat, it tests for spirit. It watches and it sees what a man is made of when the path disappears. Jed continued, his voice dropping to a low murmur. They say it lets some go, the ones who show respect. But the ones who try to fight the mountain just become part of the woods. Their bones turn to white stone, and their breath becomes the fog. Hale whimpered, and even Webb could not find the words to protest. Croft looked at his men. He saw the terror in Hale and the burgeoning madness in Webb. "We move," Croft said. "We do not fight the woods. We walk until we find a gap, or until the Watcher decides we have seen enough." They began to walk deeper into the hollow's heart, following the only direction the mountain allowed. Every step felt like an intrusion, and high above them, hidden by the gray canopy, the Watcher continued its silent vigil. The sinister tale of Civil War soldiers, what they uncovered in the barren wilderness of the Appalachians. The mountains do not merely hold secrets. They breathe them into the ears of those who dare to wander too far from the campfire's light. Before we get into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're tuning in from. What city? Which state? What country? We love knowing who's out here with us tonight. Now, let's head back to 1865. The trek through the suffocating density of the Appalachian wilderness had become a blur of gray mist and jagged stone. For 2 days, Sergeant Elias Croft and his 3 men had been walking in circles that were not circles, tracing the edges of a reality that refused to stay fixed. The woods were no longer a collection of trees and soil. They had become a living, breathing labyrinth designed to disorient and diminish the human spirit. Every time Croft checked his compass, the needle mocked him, spinning with a frantic rhythmic energy that suggested the very magnetic poles had abandoned this hollow. The air was thick, smelling of ancient rot and something metallic, like a blade being sharpened on a wet stone. They moved in single file, the silence between them heavier than the packs on their backs. Private Thomas Hale was trembling so violently that the brass buttons on his jacket rattled like dry bones. Behind him, Corporal Silas Webb had stopped trying to explain the shifting landscape. The former teacher's eyes were bloodshot and wide, his lips moving in a silent prayer, or perhaps a series of mathematical proofs that no longer added up in this godforsaken place. Jedediah Monroe, the man who knew the legends, walked with his head bowed, his hand never straying far from the iron knife at his belt. He knew that in these heights, iron was often more important than lead. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the dense canopy of laurel and oak suddenly surrendered. The men stumbled into a wide, unnatural clearing. The mist here was thinner, clinging to the ground like a white shroud, revealing a formation that made Croft's blood turn to ice. In the clearing's center stood a structure that defied military or architectural logic. It was a primitive, towering spire made of interlocking branches, river stones, and artifacts that did not belong to the natural world. As they drew closer, the details became agonizingly clear. This was not a shelter, it was an altar of memory. Woven into the gray wood were items from another life. A Union forage cap, bleached white by years of exposure, sat atop a jagged branch. Below it, a rusted cavalry saber was driven deep into a pile of stones. There were letters, their ink long faded into illegible smudges, tied to the structure with locks of human hair. Hale let out a soft, whimpering sound as he pointed to a row of brass buttons pinned to a strip of rotted leather. They were identical to the ones on their own uniforms, yet they looked a century old. This was a collection of lost things, a monument to those who had been swallowed by the ridges before them. There were no signs of a struggle, no splashes of old blood on the stones, only the quiet, terrifying evidence of disappearance. "It is a counting house," Jedediah whispered, his voice cracking. "The Watcher does not just observe, it collects. It takes the things that define a man until nothing is left but the shadow." Silas Webb stepped forward, his rational mind finally snapping under the weight of the impossible. He reached out a trembling hand toward a silver locket hanging from a protruding twig. "This isn't real. he hissed, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. "It's a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and dampness. This structure is a trick of the light, a localized phenomenon of the mountain air." He grabbed the locket, intending to tear it away to prove its insubstantiality, but as his fingers closed around the metal, he froze. A look of absolute, soul-shattering horror crossed his face. He didn't scream. He simply collapsed to his knees, his hands dropping to his sides as the locket swung gently, undisturbed. "Thomas," Croft barked, sensing the shift in the air. "Get him up. We are leaving now." But Hale did not move. He was staring past the structure toward the clearing's northern edge, where the forest resumed its impenetrable wall. His face was ghostly pale, his eyes fixed on a shadow darker than the rest. There, standing perfectly still between two ancient hemlocks, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and draped in tatters of gray cloth that seemed to bleed into the mist. It had no discernible face, only a suggestion of features beneath a hood of woven moss. It did not move. It did not breathe. It simply stood, a silent sentinel watching the invaders of its sanctuary. The Watcher's presence was not like facing an enemy soldier. There was no heat of anger, no surge of adrenaline. Instead, there was a cold, crushing weight settling in the center of Croft's chest, a realization that they were utterly insignificant in the eyes of this ancient thing. The figure was the mountain, and the mountain was the figure. In that moment, Croft understood the bargain that had to be made. He saw the items on the spire for what they were, tolls paid for a passage never guaranteed. "Drop your kits," Croft commanded, his voice sounding hollow and strange in his own ears. Sergeant Monroe asked, his eyes darting from the figure to Croft. "The rations, the extra boots, the medals. Leave them," Croft ordered, his hand moving to his vest pocket. He pulled out a heavy silver watch, a gift from his father before the Maryland campaign. It was the only thing of value he owned. With a steady hand, he walked to the spire's base and placed the watch on a flat stone. Following his lead, the others began to shed their burdens. Hale dropped his canteen and a small Bible. Even the broken Webb fumbled with his brass compass, laying it in the dirt with a trembling hand. They stripped themselves of their attachments to the world of men, offering their prized possessions to the ridge's silent guardian. Croft didn't wait to see if the figure approved. He grabbed Webb by his coat collar and hauled him upright. "We walk," Croft whispered, never taking his eyes off the shadow between the trees. "We walk and we do not look back. If we stop, we become part of the spire." They backed away from the clearing, their movements slow and deliberate, like men retreating from a sleeping predator. As they crossed the threshold back into the dense trees, Hale stole one last glance toward the hemlocks. The figure was gone. In its place was only the swirling mist and the absolute, terrifying silence of the heights. The path ahead was still unknown, but for the first time in days, the air felt a fraction lighter, as if the mountain had momentarily exhaled, allowing them one final chance to escape wilderness's green throat. They turned and fled into the deepening gloom, leaving their history behind them on the Watcher's altar. The sinister tale of Civil War soldiers, what they uncovered in the barren wilderness of the Appalachians. Before we get into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're tuning in from. What city, what state, what country? We love knowing who's out here with us tonight. Now, let's head back to 1865. The clearing receded into the gray veil of the mist, but the spire's image remained, burned into the backs of their eyelids. They moved with a frantic, stumbling urgency, their boots slipping on the rain, slicked shale and the rotting carpets of ancient needles. The weight they had shared at that ritualistic structure's base should have made their pace swifter, yet every man felt a peculiar phantom heaviness dragging at his limbs. It was as if by surrendering their earthly possessions, the watches, the letters, the brass buttons of their service, they had also surrendered a piece of their own gravity. Sergeant Elias Croft led them blindly, his hand gripping his rifle's cold iron with a white, knuckled intensity that was more habit than hope. He did not look back. He knew that if he turned his head, even for a fleeting second, he might see that impossibly thin, gray-draped figure standing right behind him, its moss-woven hood leaning close to whisper a secret. That would surely undo his mind. The forest grew denser, the trees twisting into agonized shapes that seemed to reach out and snag at their tattered wool uniforms. This was the territory known to locals as a laurel hell, a sprawling, impenetrable thicket of mountain laurel, so tightly woven that a man could walk for hours and never touch the actual ground. Trapped instead in a cage of gnarled wood and suffocating leaves, the air here was stagnant, smelling of deep earth and something metallic, like an old penny resting on a dead tongue. Private Thomas Hale was hyperventilating, his breaths coming in ragged, shallow gulps that echoed too loudly in the oppressive dampness. He kept his eyes fixed on Croft's back center, terrified that if he blinked, the sergeant would vanish into the fog, leaving him alone in the ridge's green throat. Hale felt a prickly sensation on the nape of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of a predatory gaze tracking his every movement, measuring his heartbeat's tempo against the wilderness's ticking clock. Beside him, Corporal Silas Webb was a shell of a man. The former teacher, who had once prided himself on his ability to categorize the world into neat columns of logic and reason, was now staring into a void that no equation could fill. His hands were empty, his fingers twitching rhythmically, as if he were still trying to grasp the silver locket he had left behind on the stone altar. There was a glazed, hollow look in his eyes, a profound disconnection from the trail's reality. He followed the group, not out of a will to survive, but because the march's momentum was the only thing left to him. Webb's silence was the most terrifying thing of all. It was the silence of a man who had looked behind the world's curtain and found nothing but a cold, observant eye. He no longer questioned the shifting geography or the impossible shadows. He had simply accepted that the civilized world's rules had been revoked the moment they crossed the first ridge. Jedediah Monroe moved with a different kind of intensity. He was the only one who seemed to understand the gravity of the bargain they had just struck. He kept his head bowed, his lips moving in a silent, frantic recitation of old mountain charms and half-remembered prayers. To Jed, the Watcher was not a ghost or a hallucination, but a fundamental force of the Appalachians, as real as the granite peaks and the gorges rushing white water. He knew that the items they had left behind were more than just tolls. They were anchors. By leaving their things, they had hoped to buy back their souls, but the mountain was a greedy creditor. Jed's hand never left his iron knife's hilt, his knuckles bruised and blue from the cold. He knew that in these ancient places, iron was the only thing holding any authority over the shadows. A thin line of protection between the living and the things that had forgotten how to die. The sun, if it existed at all behind the iron-gray clouds, began its slow descent, and the light in the laurel hell turned a bruised, sickly purple. The shadows did not just grow longer. They seemed to detach themselves from the trees, creeping across the forest floor like spilled ink. Croft called for a halt, not because he wanted to rest, but because the terrain had become too treacherous to navigate in the fading light. They huddled together in a small depression beneath a jutting rock overhang, their bodies pressed close for warmth. They had no blankets, no fire, no food. The hunger was a dull ache in their bellies, but it was eclipsed by a far more visceral gnawing, the hunger for a single sound that wasn't the wind or the timbers creaking. The forest was unnaturally quiet, a vacuum of noise that made the sound of their own blood rushing in their ears seem deafening. As the darkness solidified, the psychological pressure reached a breaking point. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a dry leaf felt like a deliberate provocation. Croft sat with his back against the cold stone, his eyes scanning their makeshift camp's perimeter. He felt his father's watch, his absence most acutely now. Time had become a fluid, terrifying thing, stretching and compressing without any external measure. He wondered if they had been in these mountains for days or for centuries. He wondered if the war was still happening or if the world they had come from had simply crumbled into dust while they were busy negotiating with the Watcher. The isolation was absolute. They were no longer Union soldiers. They were merely four small, flickering sparks of life in a vast, indifferent ocean of ancient stone and whispering wood. The agreement they had made in the clearing felt fragile, a temporary reprieve that could be revoked at any moment if they failed to show the proper deference to the ridge's guardian. They waited for the moon to rise, praying that the light would bring some clarity, yet fearing what the illumination might actually reveal hiding in their vision's periphery. The sinister tale of Civil War soldiers, what they uncovered in the barren wilderness of the Appalachians. The wind howled through the jagged peaks like a wounded beast, carrying the scent of damp earth and ancient, forgotten secrets into the exhausted men's lungs. Before we get into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're tuning in from. What city, what state, what country. We love knowing who's out here with us tonight. Now, let's head back to 1865. The darkness beneath the rock overhang was a physical weight, pressing against their chests until every breath felt like an act of defiance against the mountain itself. In the Appalachians' deep, suffocating hollows, the four soldiers were no longer representatives of a grand cause. They were huddled animals, stripped of the machinery of war and the certainty of their mission. Sergeant Elias Croft kept his eyes wide, straining to see through the night's impenetrable curtain. He could hear the others, the wet, ragged hitch in Thomas Hale's breathing, the rhythmic clicking of Silas Webb's teeth, and the low, barely audible murmur of Jedediah Monroe's prayers. There was no comfort in their proximity. Instead, their shared terror seemed to amplify, a cold current passing between their touching shoulders. The mountains were not merely a backdrop for their journey. They had become an active participant, a silent, stony witness to their slow unraveling. It began as a vibration in the soles of their boots before it ever reached their ears. It was not the wind, which had died down to a deceptive, haunting stillness. It was a sound that defied the forest's natural order, a low, rhythmic cadence lacking the sharp edges of human speech but possessing a terrifyingly intentional structure. It was the sound of a voice, or perhaps 1,000 voices layered into a single droning hum, echoing from the gorge's deep throat below them. "Hail," Croft whispered, a small, pathetic sound from a boy who had seen too much. Croft reached out to grip the lad's shoulder, his fingers digging into his coat's thin wool. They did not speak. To speak was to acknowledge that the sound was real, and to acknowledge it was to invite it closer. Corporal Silas Webb, once the arbiter of logic and a man of letters, simply stared into the blackness, his eyes unblinking. He was no longer looking for an explanation. He was waiting for the inevitable. Jedediah Monroe leaned toward the sergeant, his voice a ghost of a whisper barely carrying over the mountain's drone. He spoke of the ridge's watcher not as a story told by firelight to frighten children, but as a warning carved into the very bones of the people who lived in these hidden, mist-choked hollows. He whispered of entities that had walked these trails before the first axe ever struck a tree. Beings who did not understand the concept of borders, states, or wars, only the sanctity of the high, cold places, according to the mountain folk Jed had encountered in his youth. The Watcher did not hunt with tooth or claw. It hunted with the mind, peeling away a man's sanity layers until nothing was left but the raw, shivering core of his soul. The items they had left at the stone structure were a leaving, an ancient gesture of appeasement meant to signal that they were merely passing through. Yet Jed's trembling hands suggested that the price might not have been sufficient for their safe passage. As the gray, sickly light of a pre-dawn fog began to seep into their crevice, the true horror of their situation became apparent. The trail they had followed to reach this shelter was gone. In its place stood a wall of rhododendron and mountain laurel so thick it looked as though it had been growing there for decades. The very ridge's geography had altered during the night, as if the mountain had breathed and shifted its weight while they were paralyzed by fear. Croft stood, his joints popping with a sound like pistol shots in the silence. He looked at his men. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes shadowed by a weariness deeper than physical exhaustion. They were trapped in a labyrinth of green and gray, a vertical wilderness that seemed determined to swallow them whole. The sergeant realized then that they weren't just lost. They were being curated, moved like pieces on a board by a hand they could not see, and a will they could not comprehend. Silas Webb was the first to break the morning silence, but not with words of comfort or tactical advice. He began to laugh, a soft, dry sound rattling in his throat like dead leaves skittering across a grave. He pointed toward a nearby tree where a fresh symbol had been carved into the dark bark. It was the same jagged mark Jed had identified earlier, but this one was still weeping sap, the wood beneath the cut pale and raw. It hadn't been there when they huddled down the night before. Someone or something had stood inches from them while they slept, marking their new prison's boundary. Croft felt a surge of cold fury, a desperate need to reclaim his authority. But there was no enemy to shoot, no officer to report to. Only the mist, the trees, and the crushing weight of the Appalachians. They began to move again, but it was a clumsy, desperate progress. The Laurel Hell was a cage of gnarled wood that snagged at their clothes and scratched at their skin like tiny wooden fingers. Every few yards, they found another sign of the Watcher's presence. A brass button from Hale's jacket, which he hadn't even realized was missing, was found sitting perfectly balanced on top of a mossy stone 10 yards from where they had slept. Later, Webb found his own spectacles, which he thought were tucked securely in his pocket, hanging from a high branch well out of reach. The Watcher was playing with them, demonstrating a terrifying level of intimacy and access to their most private spaces. The psychological toll was becoming unbearable. The forest was no longer a place of trees and soil, but a vast living entity slowly digesting them. Croft looked at the sky, but the canopy was so thick that the sun was nothing more than a pale, indifferent smudge. They were descending further into the ridge's green throat, and with every step, the world they once knew felt more like a dream rapidly fading into the mist. The sinister tale of Civil War soldiers, what they uncovered in the barren wilderness of the Appalachians. The mountains hold secrets that the history books were too afraid to write, secrets buried under layers of mist and the blood of those who wandered too far from the trail. Before we get into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're tuning in from. What city, what state, what country? We love knowing who's out here with us tonight. Now, let's head back to 1865. The descent from the rock overhang was not a journey of miles, but a slide into a fever dream where nature's laws were being rewritten by an ancient hand. Sergeant Elias Croft led the way, his saber now used as a machete to hack through the Laurel Hill's interlocking branches. Every snap of a twig sounded like a bone breaking in the oppressive silence. The air in this lower reach of the gorge was stagnant, smelling of ancient rot and something metallic, like blood on a cold bayonet. Thomas Hale followed closely, his eyes darting toward every shadow. He had stopped asking about the road. It felt like a memory from a different life. Behind him, Silas Webb moved with a mechanical gait, his lips moving in a silent recitation of facts that no longer applied to these twisting paths. They were no longer soldiers. They were intruders in a domain that did not recognize their rank or their war. They reached a churning stream that should have offered relief, but as they knelt to wash, Jedediah Monroe gripped Croft's arm in terror. He pointed at the water. It was not flowing down toward the valley. Instead, the dark, peat-stained liquid was rippling upward, defying gravity and crawling toward the jagged peaks with a rhythmic pulse, like blood in a vein. The stream did not splash. It slid over the rocks with a predatory grace that made the skin crawl. Silas Webb stared, his scientific mind buckling. He dropped his tin cup, watching as it was carried uphill by the current, disappearing into the white mist. "It's not right," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The mass, the gravity, it's broken." Croft didn't answer. There was no logic left to offer, only the necessity of movement. The water continued its impossible ascent, a silent mockery of the world they had left behind, reminding them that the mountain operated on a clock and a compass not of human manufacture. As they pushed deeper, the environment changed from wilderness into a monument. They found an ancient oak in a rare clearing, its bark blistered as if struck by 1,000 lightning bolts. Nailed to its trunk were dozens of military caps, Union blue and Confederate gray, some weathered to bone white, others still retaining a hint of their former color. There were no bodies, just the caps arranged in a silent, terrifying gallery. It was a testament to the many men led into these ridges by the same unseen shepherd that now watched them from the fog. Hale reached out to touch a faded cap, but Jed pulled him back with a hissed warning. He warned the boy never to touch what belonged to the ridge, for everything here has a price, and those men had paid it. The caps seemed to watch them as they passed, a hollow audience of ghosts who had once marched just as they did. The sergeant felt a constant prickling at the base of his neck, the sensation of 1,000 eyes focused on his back. He turned frequently, his hand on his revolver, but there was never anything but the shifting gray curtain of mist. The watcher was not a creature of sudden movement. It was a presence in the stillness between heartbeats. Croft realized they were being herded. The thickets were too dense to penetrate in any direction except the one the mountain allowed. They were being funneled toward the ridge's center, toward the heart of the silence they had been fleeing. Every step felt heavier, as if the ground were pulling at the iron in their blood, dragging them deeper into the earth's cold embrace. The very geography was conspiring to ensure their path led only one way, stripping away their choices until only the watcher's path remained open. By mid-afternoon, the sun was swallowed by charcoal clouds, the temperature plummeted, and a stinging sleet began to fall, turning the world into a mosaic of gray. The sleet coated their uniforms in a thin layer of ice, making every movement sound like dead leaves rustling. They stood at the edge of a narrow fissure, a gorge within a gorge descending into the world's bowels. The wind through the crevice was a mournful howl, like a spectral choir singing in a language predating man. Jedediah Monroe knelt at the edge, tracing symbols carved into the wet stone. He whispered that they were in the deep places now, where the world's skin is thin and the veil is torn. He warned Croft that the Watcher doesn't just look at men here, it talks to the parts of the soul they hide. The sergeant looked at his men. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes reflecting an ancient light. They were pilgrims in a cathedral of shadow, waiting for a revelation they might not survive. The mist began to thicken around their feet, curling upward like skeletal fingers reaching for their very existence. The descent into the narrow fissure felt like entering a great slumbering beast's gullet. As Sergeant Elias Croft led the way, his boots scraping against the slick, damp limestone, the air grew noticeably colder, a heavy subterranean chill emanating from the rock itself rather than the sky. The sleet that had been a stinging annoyance above became a ghostly mist down here, swirling in the narrow gap between the cliffs as if stirred by invisible hands. Thomas Hale struggled behind him, his breathing ragged and echoing in the confined space. Each gasp sounded like a saw cutting through dry wood. Croft could feel the claustrophobia pressing in, the Appalachian gorge's walls narrowing until they were forced to move sideways, their packs scraping against the ancient, fossil, embedded stone. It was a place where the sun had never reached, a sanctuary for shadows undisturbed since the dawn of time. As they reached a wider ledge halfway down the crevice, Silas Webb called out a strangled cry of disbelief. He was staring at his brass-cased compass, held in a hand trembling with more than just the cold. The needle was no longer seeking north. Instead, it was spinning in slow, hypnotic circles, clicking rhythmically against the glass as if trying to keep time with an unheard heartbeat. Webb shook the device, his face a mask of intellectual agony, but the needle remained caught in its impossible dance. He looked at Croft, his eyes wide and hollow, seeking a rational explanation the sergeant could not provide. The world's fundamental laws, the very forces guiding sailors across oceans and armies across continents, had been discarded by the mountain. They were no longer in the Virginia they knew. They were in a pocket of existence where man's compass held no authority. The psychological weight of the isolation began to manifest in stranger ways as they continued their downward crawl. Jedediah Monroe, usually the group's most stoic regarding physical hardship, stopped dead in his tracks. He pointed to a small crevice in the rock wall where a familiar object sat perched on a natural stone shelf. It was a small hand-carved wooden soldier, a toy Private Hale had carried in his pocket since leaving Pennsylvania. Hale reached into his coat, his face turning ashen as his fingers found nothing but lint. The toy was there, 10 feet deep in a fissure they had only just entered, yet it looked as though it had been sitting in that dark hole for decades, covered in a fine layer of gray dust and spiderwebs. No one spoke. The implication was too terrifying to voice. The Watcher was not just following them, it was moving ahead of them, distorting their sense of time and possession. Croft ordered them to keep moving, his voice a low growl lacking its usual conviction. They finally spilled out onto the gorge floor, a place where trees grew in shapes defying the natural order. The trunks were not vertical but twisted into agonizing spirals, their branches interwoven so tightly that they formed a literal roof of dead gray wood. Beneath this canopy, the air was unnervingly still. There was no wind here, yet the leaves on the ground skittered and turned as if stepped on by 1,000 tiny, unseen feet. It was here that Jedediah finally broke the silence, his voice a mere whisper that seemed to carry further than a shout. He spoke of the ridge's Watcher not as a ghost, but as a judge. He explained that in the old stories of the mountain folk, the Watcher doesn't hunt the body, it weighs the spirit. It strips away a man's layers, his rank, his pride, his memories, until only the raw truth of his soul remains. Thomas Hale was the first to see the figure again. It was standing at the edge of a dense black rhododendron thicket, a silhouette darker than the surrounding gloom. It didn't have a man's proportions nor an animal's stance. It was tall, impossibly thin, and draped in what looked like the tattered remains of 1,000 different fabrics, scraps of wool, leather, and hide blending perfectly with the bark and the shadow. Before Croft could even raise his rifle, the figure drifted backward, not running, but simply dissolving into the forest's density. The sergeant felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest, a realization that they weren't being hunted for food or out of malice. They were being observed as one might observe an insect in a jar, waiting to see which way it turns when the walls begin to close in. Sela's web began to laugh then, a dry, brittle sound that made the hair on Croft's neck stand up. He was kneeling in the dirt, tracing the patterns of the fallen leaves. He claimed he could see the geometry of it now, the way the trees were planted in specific sequences to channel their thoughts, the way the stream's sound was tuned to a frequency breaking the human will. His skepticism had not vanished. It had inverted, turning into a frantic, obsessive need to find a scientific formula for their impending madness. He was trying to calculate the shadow's weight, to measure the distance between their reality and the mountain's nightmare. Croft grabbed him by the collar, hauling him to his feet, but Webb's eyes remained distant, fixed on a horizon only he could see through the thicket. The group pressed on, driven by a primal need to find an exit that seemed increasingly mythical. The forest floor began to rise again, leading them toward a clearing that felt like a grand, natural amphitheater's center. In the middle of this space sat a mound of earth and stone, topped with a single flat slab of slate. Arranged on the slate were the missing items from their Trek Webb's spectacles, the page from his journal, a single brass button from Croft's tunic, and the wooden soldier. They were laid out with surgical precision, a silent invitation or a final warning. The mist began to solidify around the clearing's edges, forming a white wall cutting off their retreat. The Watcher was no longer behind them or beside them. It was waiting for them to acknowledge the altar they had unwittingly built with their own fear. They stood at the threshold of the deep places where men's war was a forgotten whisper. and the ridge's judgment was the only law remaining. The sinister tale of Civil War soldiers, what they uncovered in the barren wilderness of the Appalachians. The high ridge's gray shadows are long, and they do not always belong to the mountain trees. Before we get into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're tuning in from. We love knowing who's out here with us tonight. Now, let's head back to 1865. The soldiers stood in a semicircle around the slate slab, the wilderness's silence pressing like deep water. Sergeant Elias Croft felt the cold moisture of the mist seeping through his coat. On the stone, the items were arranged with a terrifying geometric precision. His own brass button sat in the center, flanked by Silas Webb's spectacles and the page torn from the corporal's journal. Beside them, the small wooden soldier Thomas Hale had carried stood upright, its painted face staring blankly at the men who had failed to protect it. There was no wind in this clearing, yet the journal page's edges fluttered occasionally as if stirred by a breath not belonging to any of them. Croft looked at his men. Private Thomas Hale was ashen, his hands buried deep in his pockets. Corporal Silas Webb was staring at his glasses with a look of profound betrayal. Seeing them here, placed upon this natural altar by an unseen hand, was a physical blow to his sanity. He began to murmur a low, frantic string of words about optical physics, but his voice was without conviction. It was the sound of a man trying to talk himself out of a nightmare. "It's a tithe," Jedediah Monroe whispered, his voice barely audible. The former Confederate deserter stood with his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting toward the impenetrable wall of white mist. The old folks in the hollers, they talked about the Watcher's toll. You don't take back what the mountain has claimed. You leave it, and maybe, just maybe, it lets you pass through to the next ridge. Croft felt the instinctive urge to command his men to retrieve their belongings. They were Union soldiers, and these were their properties. But as he stepped forward, air in the clearing seemed to thicken. The shadows of the tree line shifted, stretching out like a man's sharp fingers toward the slab's center. He realized then that this wasn't a theft, it was an interrogation. "Leave them," Croft ordered, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ears. It was a rasping command defying every military regulation. "We move, now." Hale let out a choked sob of relief, but Webb lingered a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the journal page recording their trek. He looked as though he wanted to reach for it, but the sergeant grabbed him by the shoulder and hauled him backward. As they retreated from the clearing, the mist seemed to swallow the altar almost instantly, the white veil closing over the stone slab as if it had never existed. They plunged back into the forest, but the geography had shifted once more. The trees were no longer the familiar oaks and maples. Here, the trunks were gnarled and blackened, their bark peeling away in long, wet strips. The branches were interwoven so tightly they strangled the light. The ground beneath their boots was spongy and unstable, carpeted in a layer of pale moss that seemed to glow with a faint phosphorescent light. Thomas Hale was the first to notice the change. The silence that had plagued them for days was gone, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrumming felt as if it were vibrating through the very soles of their boots. It wasn't a sound heard by the ears so much as a sensation felt in the bone. It was the ridge's heartbeat, ancient and slow. "It's following us," Hale said, stopping dead. He pointed back toward the way they had come. Croft turned, his rifle raised. At first, he saw nothing but the twisted trunks and the shifting curtains of fog. Then he saw it. The Watcher was standing in the middle of their trail, perhaps 50 paces back. It stood tall and thin, its silhouette a jagged tear in the forest's fabric. It was draped in a chaotic mantle of gray and brown rags, scraps of fabric collected from past decades. There was no face, only a dark, hollow space where a head should be, framed by a crown of tangled briars. The figure didn't move, it didn't threaten, it simply observed. Croft felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He realized that the Watcher wasn't just a physical presence, it was a mirror. In its stillness, he saw his own exhaustion's reflection. Croft forced himself to look away from the figure. He grabbed Webb by the collar and hauled him to his feet with desperate strength. They couldn't stay. They had to move deeper into the ridges. They began to run, slipping on moss, gasping for air. Behind them, the mountain's low thrumming grew louder, a vibration that seemed to be cheering their flight. They were no longer soldiers. They were prey in a sanctuary that had forgotten mercy's meaning, driven by a fear with no name but possessing 1,000 ancient faces. The soldiers' boots thudded against the yielding earth, a frantic rhythm matching their hammering hearts. The air in this Appalachian pocket had grown thick, tasting of ancient rot and wet stone. Every breath was a labor, a heavy draft of mist chilling the lungs from the inside out. Sergeant Elias Croft led the way, his gaze fixed forward, though his mind anchored to the image of the figure standing behind them. The Watcher, a silent sentinel of a world predating men's maps, he didn't look back. To look back was to acknowledge the impossible, granting the shadow a power over his soul he was not ready to surrender. Behind him, Thomas Hale's breathing was a series of ragged gasps. The boy was flagging, his strength stripped by hunger and the pressure of the unseen. Next came Silas Webb, whose movements were no longer those of a disciplined soldier, but the instinctive flailing of a creature caught in a snare. Jedediah Monroe brought up the rear, his eyes roaming, his lips moving in a silent prayer or warding charms learned in his youth's sunless hollows. The forest seemed to tighten around their small group. The gnarled trees, their bark like charred flesh, leaned inward as if listening to their passage. The low thrumming that had begun at the altar deepened a vibration, rattling the brass buttons on their uniforms and the bayonets at their hips. It was the mountain's clock sound, ticking in centuries rather than seconds. Croft felt a terrifying realization. They weren't running toward safety, they were being funneled. The landscape was a maze, and the Watcher was the architect, shifting fog walls to guide them toward a destination they had no part in choosing. Croft finally commanded a stop, his voice a hoarse croak. They had reached a jagged ravine, a vertical drop into a sea of white vapor hiding the bottom. The path they followed simply ended, severed by a geological scar, looking torn open by a giant's hand. The men collapsed, huddling for a warmth the damp air refused to provide. Webb sat with his head in his hands, fingers digging into his scalp. "It shouldn't be here," he whispered. "The maps show no gorge of this magnitude in this quadrant. It is a physical impossibility, Elias. A valley of this depth would have been recorded by the scouts years ago." Monroe looked at him with weary acceptance. He stared into the dark woods they had just fled. "The scouts didn't see what we're seeing, Silas. They saw trees and dirt. We're seeing the world's bones. We've stepped off the map. This ain't Virginia and it ain't Tennessee. It's the Watcher's porch, and we're the uninvited guests who forgot to knock." Hale looked up, his face gaunt in the twilight. "Will it come for us tonight? The thing in the rags, it just stood there. It didn't have a face, Sarge. I looked, and there was just a hole in the air." Croft checked his rifle, the weight providing meager comfort. The powder was damp, the flint worn. Here his weapon felt like a toy, a relic of a civilization holding no jurisdiction over these ridges. "We don't know what it is," Croft said, trying to regain his command, "but it hasn't moved against us yet. It took our things, but it left us our lives. We keep our eyes open. We take turns watching the tree line." Webb snapped back, his voice brittle. "Watching for what? A ghost? A collective hallucination? Tell me, Sergeant, how do we shoot a shadow? How do we outrun a mountain that moves its own trees?" Croft didn't answer. He looked over the ravine, watching mist swirl in the depths. It coiled and pulsed, mimicking shapes that shouldn't exist, towering spires and arched bridges of bone. The thrumming in the ground was louder now, a heavy beat coming from directly beneath their boots. The sergeant realized that the Watcher wasn't hunting them like a wolf. It was observing them, testing their minds' integrity. The war they had left behind, with its cannons and cavalry charges, seemed like a distant dream compared to this wilderness's chaotic silence. Out there, men died for causes, for flags, or for pieces of dirt. Here, they were being unmade, their identities stripped away until only the raw, shivering core of their humanity remained. Croft gripped his rifle tighter. He wondered if the Watcher was waiting for them to break, or waiting for them to finally understand the Ridge's language. A language written in silence and shadow, older than the Republic and indifferent to any soldier's fate wandering into its heart. Night fell with an oppressive weight, light being sucked from the sky. The stars did not appear. Instead, darkness was absolute, save for the unsettling glow of the moss and sparks of static dancing along their rifles' barrels. The bioluminescent moss cast an ethereal, sickly green light upon the men's faces, making them look like specters already departed from the living world. Their eyes reflected this dim radiance, wide and glass-like, devoid of the hope spark that usually sustained a soldier in the field. 4 men sat alone on the abyss's edge, while the ancient guardian watched from the trees, patient and eternal. As the blackness deepened, the forest sounds changed. The thrumming was joined by a sound like dry parchment rubbing together, the rustle of the Watcher's tattered mantle moving through the underbrush. Croft felt a cold chill. It was the realization that their journey was no longer a mission, but a pilgrimage into the unknown, and the passage price had yet to be fully paid. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with the mountain's expectation. A vast and ancient patience seeming to wait for a single word or a final surrender. They were no longer the hunters, and they were no longer a great army's scouts. They were merely witnesses to a power that did not care for men's politics or nations' boundaries. A power that looked upon their suffering with the cold, unblinking eye of the stones themselves. Croft closed his eyes for a moment, but the faceless thing in the wood's image remained burned into his retinas. A reminder that some boundaries were never meant to be crossed. The sinister tale of Civil War soldiers, what they uncovered in the barren wilderness of the Appalachians. The mist did not merely drift, it breathed, a slow and rhythmic exhalation from the mountain's very lungs that seemed to savor the scent of their fear. Before we get into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're tuning in from, what city, what state, what country. We love knowing who's out here with us tonight. Now let's head back to 1865. The soldiers clung to the jagged ravine's edge, as if the crumbly soil were the last tether to a reality rapidly dissolving. Sergeant Elias Croft felt the heavy vibration in the soles of his boots, a rhythmic thrumming feeling less like a sound and more like the earth's own beating heart. It was a subterranean pulse, ancient and indifferent to the 4 men shivering in the damp shadows. The bioluminescent moss, clinging to the wet rock faces, cast a sickly emerald pallor over the group, transforming their worn Union uniforms into ghosts' tattered shrouds. Every breath they took was a struggle against the air, which had grown thick and heavy, laden with static's metallic tang and the ancient smell of damp earth and rot. The Appalachian wilderness was no longer a theater of war. It had become a cathedral of the unknown, and they were the unwilling acolytes at its altar. Corporal Silas Webb sat with his back against a weeping stone, his fingers clutching a pencil that had long since snapped in his pocket. To a man of logic, a man who had taught rigid geometry and physics laws to children in a brick schoolhouse, this place was a waking nightmare of impossible dimensions. The gorge before them was a physical contradiction. According to the topographical surveys he had studied, no such rift existed in this region. The mountains were supposed to roll and fold, not break open into bottomless abysses, swallowing the very stars. Webb's mind, once his greatest weapon, was now a fractured mirror reflecting only their situation's absurdity. He whispered to himself, reciting Virginia county names and great battle dates, a desperate attempt to anchor his consciousness to the world he understood. But the mountain did not care for names or dates. It only cared for their intrusion's weight. The mathematical certainty he once held was eroding, replaced by the terrifying realization that some parts of the world refused to be measured or mapped. Jedediah Monroe watched the tree line with the weary, hollow, doubt eyes of a man who had seen the veil between worlds pulled back. He knew that their presence here was no longer a matter of military reconnaissance. They had crossed a boundary never meant for the living, a threshold where men's rules were replaced by the Watcher's whims. He spoke in low, gravelly tones about the Watcher's porch, a place where the mountain judged the worth of souls daring to trespass. According to his ancestors' whispers, those who reached this high ridge were no longer in the south or the north. They were in the in-between, a liminal space where past and future were irrelevant. To Monroe, the Watcher was not a monster to be fought, but a force of nature to be endured, like a winter storm or a rising flood. His superstitions, once mocked by Webb, were now the only map they had left, though it was a map of shadows and warnings rather than paths and rivers. He clutched a small, smooth riverstone in his hand, a charm against the things walking in the gray light. Beside him, young Thomas Hale was a portrait of shattered innocence. The boy's gaze was fixed on the darkness where he had seen the faceless figure. He described it as a hole in the air, a void moving with terrifying grace. The war's trauma had been enough to age him, but this experience was stripping away his very essence. He no longer asked about when they would return to Pennsylvania or what they would eat. His world had narrowed to the sergeant's immediate proximity and the terrifying certainty that they were being evaluated by something lacking a human heart. The wood's silence was worse than a cannonade's roar. In the silence, there was no distraction from their own insignificance's realization. He huddled closer to the dying embers of their resolve, his hands shaking with a cold no fire could ever reach. Croft gripped his Springfield rifle, the wood slick with condensation. He looked at the brass buttons on his coat, now tarnished and dull, and realized how hollow his rank symbols had become. In the army, he was a leader of men, a veteran of horrific skirmishes and long marches. Here, he was merely the eldest among the lost, a shepherd of 3 terrified souls in a pasture of ghosts. The thrumming in the ground grew louder, a deep bass note seeming to vibrate his very teeth. Small sparks of blue static electricity began to dance along their rifles' iron barrels, a phenomenon that should have been fascinating but was instead deeply ominous. It was as if the atmosphere itself were charging, preparing for a revelation their minds were not equipped to handle. He checked his weapon's percussion caps, knowing full well that lead and powder were useless against the gorge's shifting walls. They were being unmade. That was the only word Croft could find for it. The identities they had forged in the Civil War's fire, the soldier, the teacher, the farm boy, the deserter, were being peeled away like dead skin layers. The Watcher was peeling them back to see what remained underneath. Were they men of courage, or merely animals driven by a fear of the dark? The mountain was a crucible, and the heat was rising. Croft wondered if any of them would have the strength to remain whole, or if they would all eventually succumb to the ridge's chaotic silence. The war they had left behind seemed like a petty squabble between children compared to the vast, cold eternity surrounding them now. Flags and borders meant nothing to the stones and the fog. The only thing that mattered was the breath in their lungs and the increasingly fragile tether of their sanity. The sound of dry parchment rubbing together returned, drifting on a wind that shouldn't have existed in the sheltered ravine. It was the Watcher's mantle's sound, a tattered shroud of centuries moving through the underbrush. They were being watched not with malice, but with a clinical, ancient patience. The soldiers were witnesses now, not to history, but to a reality predating man's very concept. As the absolute darkness of the Appalachian night settled over them, heavy as a burial shroud, Croft realized that their passage price had yet to be demanded. They were waiting for the mountain to speak, and when it did, they knew their lives would never be the same again. The emerald moss glow flickered, casting long distorted shadows against the ravine wall, making it appear as though the rocks themselves were shifting, closing in to finalize their isolation from the living world. Croft closed his eyes, praying for a dawn that felt like it might never come, while the unseen guardian tightened its invisible grip on the ridge, watching the humanity's flickering sparks fade into the blackness, the sinister tale of Civil War soldiers, what they uncovered in the barren wilderness of the Appalachians. The mountains do not forget, and they certainly do not forgive those who step where God's light has long since flickered out. Before we get into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're tuning in from, what city, what state, what country. We love knowing who's out here with us tonight. Now, let's head back to 1865. The morning didn't arrive with a rising sun's traditional fanfare. Instead, it manifested as a slow, agonizing transition from total darkness to a suffocating bruised purple. The air was thick enough to taste, flavored with wet slate's mineral tang and ancient, undisturbed rot's cloying scent. Sergeant Elias Croft stood as still as the surrounding trees, his muscles locked in a permanent tension that had long since transcended mere fatigue. He watched his men, or what remained of them, as they struggled to find their feet in the ravine's gray sludge. They looked less like Union soldiers and more like specters unearthed from a shallow grave. Their uniforms were caked in the Appalachians' dark, heavy clay, and their faces were masks of soot and terror. Every movement was a chore, every breath a battle against the damp chill that had settled into their bones during the long, haunted night. Corporal Silas Webb was the most distressing to behold. The man who had once been a pillar of intellectual certainty, a man who could explain a steam engine's mechanics or the tide's movement, was now reduced to a state of catatonic observation. He sat by the dead fire, his fingers tracing his coat's frayed edges as if trying to remember reality's tactile sensation. The logic that had served him for 34 years had proven insufficient against the mountain's architecture. The gorge they had spent the night in should not have existed according to the maps he had memorized, yet here they were, trapped in a geographic anomaly pulsing with a low, rhythmic heartbeat. Webb's eyes were wide, his pupils blown as if trying to take in more light than the environment was willing to provide. He was no longer a teacher. He was a student of a much darker, older curriculum that ignored men's laws. Jedediah Monroe moved among them with the quiet grace of a man who had accepted his own death. He spoke in hushed, gravelly tones about the ridge's altar, a place where the Watcher collected the living's tolls. He explained to Croft that they were no longer on Tennessee or Virginia soil. They were in the mountain's throat. To Monroe, the supernatural was not an abstract concept but a neighbor, a force requiring respect and a specific kind of silence. He pointed to the trees, noting how the bark seemed scarred with symbols mirroring those seen in the abandoned settlement. These were not marks of a language meant for human eyes, but boundary markers for something far more territorial and ancient. He warned them that the Watcher was not hunting them for meat, but for their very essence, testing their spirit's strength against the wilderness's weight. As they began their ascent out of the ravine, the forest seemed to react to their movement. The silence was absolute, a heavy, ringing void pressing against their eardrums. There were no birds, no squirrels, not even a breeze rustle through the high canopy. The only sound was their boots' rhythmic thud and their breaths' ragged gasps. Thomas Hale, the youngest among them, walked in a trance. Like State, his Springfield rifle held loosely at his side. He was the first to notice the vegetation's change. The mountain laurel, which should have been dormant in the late winter chill, was twisted and vibrant, its waxy leaves shimmering with a faint, iridescent film. The briars seemed to reach for them, their thorns like iron hooks, snagging on their wool coats, pulling them toward the ridge's center. The path beneath them felt soft, almost like skin, as if the mountain itself were breathing beneath their feet. By the time the sun should have been at its zenith, though the sky remained a uniform sheet of leaden gray, they reached a plateau that felt like the world's roof. The trees suddenly vanished, giving way to a wide, circular clearing unnaturally level. In this space's center sat the rock formation Monroe had hinted at. It was a primitive shrine, a cairn of smooth black stones rising nearly 6 feet into the air. It was held together by a complex web of woven roots and animal sinew, but it was the items tucked into the stones that made Croft's heart stutter. It was a museum of the missing. He saw a rusted cavalry saber, its hilt wrapped in a tattered Union sash. He saw a pair of spectacles, their glass cracked but still reflecting the dull light. There were buttons, locks of hair tied with string, a child's leather shoe, and a stack of letters so weathered they had become a single, pulpy mass. This was not a place of slaughter, but a place of collection. Each item represented a life diverted into these woods and never returned. There were artifacts from the current war, certainly, but beneath them were objects looking a century old, hand-forged nails, pewter spoons, and flintlock rifles fragments. The Watcher had been here for a long time, and its harvest was vast. Sila's Webb collapsed to his knees at the shrine's edge, his hand reaching out to touch a small, silver locket dangling from a protruding root. He didn't scream. He simply let out a low, mournful sound, the sound of a man finally understanding his own insignificance's scale in the face of eternity. Then the air in the clearing curdled. A shadow, deeper and more solid than the mist, detached itself from the tree line. It was the Watcher. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its form draped in a heavy, tattered cloak, appearing to be made of living moss and shadows. It had no face, only a smooth gray expanse where features should have been, yet the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. It didn't move toward them, but the pressure in the air increased until Croft felt like his lungs were being squeezed by a giant's hand. The figure was a guardian, an ancient sentinel of the ridges, and it was waiting. Croft realized then that they could not fight this presence. You cannot shoot the wind or bayonet the fog. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his sergeant's whistle, the one that had signaled the charge at Cold Harbor. He stepped forward, his legs trembling, and placed the brass whistle on the flat stone at the cairn's base. It was a surrender. Following his lead, Monroe dropped his skinning knife, and Hale left behind a small, carved wooden cross. Even Webb managed to unpin his corporal stripes and lay them on the stones. As the last item was placed, the figure in the trees seemed to dissolve. It didn't walk away. It simply faded into the forest's gray background. The suffocating pressure lifted, and for the first time in days, the wind began to blow. Croft didn't say a word. He grabbed Webb by the shoulder, hauling him to his feet, and gestured for the others to follow. They turned their backs on the shrine and the Watcher, heading toward a gap in the trees that hadn't been there moments before, praying they were finally being allowed to leave. The sinister tale of Civil War soldiers, what they uncovered in the barren wilderness of the Appalachians. The mountains do not merely hold secrets. They hold memories that have outlived the civilizations that once tried to tame them, breathing through the stone and the fog as if time itself were nothing more than a passing breeze. Before we get into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're tuning in from. What city? What state? What country? We love knowing who's out here with us tonight. Now, let's head back to 1865. The jagged opening in the timberline felt like a mouth that had finally chosen to spit them out rather than swallow them whole. Sergeant Elias Croft did not hesitate, pushing Corporal Sila's Webb forward with a strength born of pure military discipline. They moved through the threshold, leaving behind the shrine of the missing and the Watcher's heavy, faceless gaze. As they stepped into the dense hemlock's shadow, the atmosphere shifted. The suffocating rhythmic pressure that had pulsed against their temples since entering the gorge began to ebb, replaced by a hollow, ringing silence that was somehow more haunting. It was the silence of a void, a space where the mountain had finished its interrogation. Croft's hand instinctively went to his pocket, searching for the brass whistle that had been his constant companion since Cold Harbor's carnage. But his fingers found only lint and his trousers' rough wool. The loss was a physical ache, a phantom limb throbbing with every step. He had traded a piece of his identity for their lives, and that bargain's weight felt heavier than any pack he had ever carried. Behind him, Sila's web moved like a marionette with its strings cut. The man who had once been able to name every rock and calculate a bullet's trajectory was gone. His eyes remained fixed on the mud beneath his boots, his lips occasionally twitching as if trying to recite a formula that no longer applied to a world where shadows could stand 7 feet tall and dissolve into the mist. Webb's logic had been his shield, and the Watcher had shattered it. He was a scholar who had looked into the sun and come away blind, his mind unable to reconcile his textbooks with the Appalachians' ancient reality. Beside him, Thomas Hale walked with a strange, glassy-eyed reverence. The young private moved with a grace not his own, his feet finding purchase on slippery roots and loose shale with an ease suggesting he was being guided. He did not look at the trees, for he no longer needed to see the Watcher to know it was there. He felt the entity's presence in the wind and the shadows. To Hale, they were no longer a squad. They were a procession of ghosts being escorted to the living world's border. Jedediah Monroe was the only one who seemed to understand their survival's mechanics. He kept his head low, his movements rhythmic and deliberate, his gaze never wandering far from the path that had miraculously appeared before them. He spoke in a low, gravelly whisper meant only for the earth, a series of apologies and acknowledgments in a dialect sounding older than the war they were supposedly fighting. He had warned them about the altar, and now that they had paid the toll, he seemed consumed by the need to maintain their departure's sanctity. He signaled for them to remain silent, his hand cutting through the air whenever someone's boots crunched too loudly against the frozen leaves. He knew that the mountain's mercy was a fragile thing, a temporary reprieve that could be rescinded at any moment if they showed the slightest bit of disrespect, or if they dared to look back at the abyss they had just escaped. The wilderness around them was no longer just a collection of trees and stones. It was a living, breathing witness, and they were the intruders granted a narrow escape window. As they descended from the high plateau, the terrain began to lose its surreal quality. The mountain laurel, once vibrant and pulsing with an unnatural iridescence, faded back into the drab, dormant browns and grays of late winter. The air grew sharper, the biting cold of the March wind returning with a vengeance stinging their exposed skin. It was a cruel, familiar pain, and Croft welcomed it. It was a sensation belonging to the world of men, a world where hunger and frostbite were the primary enemies, not the high ridge's ancient guardians. They found a small, fast-moving stream cutting a jagged path through a limestone gorge, its water clear and freezing. Following the flow was an instinct older than their military training, a fundamental survival rule that finally felt applicable again. They waded through the shallows, their boots filling with icy water, but no one complained. The physical discomfort was a tether to reality, a way to anchor their drifting minds back to the simple, brutal task of putting one foot in front of the other. The day bled into a long, gray twilight that seemed to stretch for an eternity. They did not stop to rest, for the fear of the shadows catching up to them was more potent than the exhaustion threatening to collapse their lungs. They moved through the deepening gloom like scavengers, their uniforms tattered and their spirits broken, yet driven by a primal urge to see a horizon not jagged with the Appalachian's peaks. Croft led them with a grim determination, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of a man-made structure, a fence post or an old logging trail's faint indentation. They were close to the wilderness's edge. He could feel it in the way the pressure in his chest was slowly beginning to lift, but he also knew that they would never truly leave this place. They would carry the ridge's silence in their marrow, and the faceless Watcher's image would be burned into the backs of their eyelids for as long as they lived. They were the survivors of a war with no-name soldiers who had found something in the mountains that the history books would never acknowledge. And that secret's weight was a burden that would eventually crush them all. As the first stars began to peer through the heavy cloud cover, Croft saw it, a small, collapsed stone chimney standing like a tombstone in a tangle of briars. It was a ruin, but it was a human ruin. It was the first sign of civilization they had seen in days. A marker of a world where men built things to last, however futilely. They stopped there, huddling together in the lee of the cold stone, not to sleep, but to wait for the dawn that would finally carry them home. The sinister tale of Civil War soldiers, what they uncovered in the barren wilderness of the Appalachians. The dying embers of the fire hissed as the morning frost settled upon the ruined stone chimney, a skeletal remains of a life long forgotten by the world. Before we get into this story, drop a comment right now telling us where you're tuning in from. What city? What state? What country? We love knowing who's out here with us tonight. Now, let's head back to 1865. The dawn that finally crested the Appalachians' jagged peaks did not arrive with salvation's warmth, but with a cold, clinical clarity that stripped away the men's last illusions. Sergeant Elias Croft stood among the frost-covered briars, his body aching with a fatigue reaching into his very marrow. He looked at his 3 remaining companions, seeing them clearly for the first time since they had entered the high ridges. They were ghosts in blue wool, their faces hollowed out by hunger and a terror, transcending the battlefield's simple violence. The mountain had taken their pride, their logic, and their certainty, leaving behind only the raw instinct to survive. As the gray light spread, Croft signaled for them to move. There were no orders left to give, no military objectives to secure. There was only the singular, desperate goal of finding a world where the trees did not watch and the shadows did not breathe. They found the first signs of the living world by midday. It was a rutted wagon track half hidden by dead leaves and mud, but it was unmistakably the work of men. They followed it with a mechanical, stumbling gait, their eyes fixed on the ground as if afraid that looking up would invite the wilderness to reclaim them. When they finally encountered a local farmer hauling a timber load, the man stopped his oxen team and stared at them with an expression of profound pity. He did not ask who they were or what regiment they served. The state of their uniforms and the haunted vacancy in their eyes told a story needing no words. He offered them salt pork and a skin of weak cider, which they consumed in a silence so heavy it seemed to dampen the wind's sound. To these soldiers, the simple act of chewing food grown in a sunlit field felt like a holy rite, a slow reconnection to a reality they had nearly surrendered. By the time they reached a Union outpost near the Virginia border, the news of the war's end was already filtering through the ranks. Lee was retreating, and the long, bloody nightmare of the rebellion was drawing to a close. For most soldiers, this was a time of jubilation, but for Croft's men, the nation's geopolitical fate felt distant and inconsequential. They were processed through the medical tents like casualties of a forgotten skirmish. The surgeons looked for flesh wounds and found none. Yet they noted the way Corporal Silas Webb flinched at every canvas tent rustle, and how Private Thomas Hale spent his hours staring toward the distant mountains with a look of profound mournfulness. Recognition, they were survivors, but they were not whole. The wilderness had left its mark upon them, a spiritual scar that no peace treaty could ever heal. Corporal Silas Webb was the first to succumb to what they had witnessed weight. The man who had once found comfort in mathematics' rigid laws and the physical world's predictable nature found himself unable to return to his teaching life. The logic he had once wielded as a shield had been shattered in the abandoned settlement. He spent the remainder of his days in a quiet Ohio house surrounded by books he no longer read. He would sit for hours in a darkened room, his eyes fixed on the corners where shadows pooled, convinced that the world's geometry was merely a thin veil over something ancient and hungry. He spoke to no one of the Watcher, for to name the thing was to admit that his precious reason was a lie. He died in his sleep a decade later, his face frozen in an expression of intense, focused listening. Private Thomas Hale returned to Pennsylvania's rolling hills, but he never truly left the Appalachians' ridges. He became a man of few words, a farmer who worked his land with a quiet, reverent intensity. Years after the war, he sat down to write a letter to a younger cousin who had expressed a desire to explore the Western Territories. In that letter, the only written record of their ordeal, Hale wrote that the mountains had a guardian, and it had let them go not out of mercy, but out of a dark, inscrutable curiosity. He described the Watcher not as a monster, but as a witness to men's folly, an entity that had existed long before the first surveyor's line was drawn and would remain long after the last city fell to ruin. He warned his kin never to seek the high places where the mist never lifts, for some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. Jedediah Monroe, the man who had provided the folklore and the warnings, did not stay to see peace's fruits. A few months after Appomattox's surrender, he simply walked away from his encampment. There were rumors among the veterans that he had been seen heading back toward the Tennessee border's deep gorges, carrying nothing but a knife and a small tobacco pouch. Some said he had lost his mind to the war, while others whispered that he had made a pact in the ritual clearing and had gone to fulfill his end of the bargain. He vanished into the mountain's green canopy, becoming another legend in a land already thick with them. Whether he found peace or became part of the shadow itself is a question only the ridges can answer. Sergeant Elias Croft lived the longest, carrying leadership's burden until his final breath. He never spoke of the mission, and he never used the brass whistle he had left upon the stone altar. He was a man who had looked into the abyss and survived by offering it a piece of his soul. In his final years, he would often stand on his porch as the sun set, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. He thought of the thousands of men who had marched into the wilderness during those 4 years of blood and fire, the boys who had simply vanished into the fog, leaving behind no graves and no stories. He knew now that they weren't all taken by bullets or disease. Some had simply stepped off the known world's map and into the Watcher's waiting arms. The Civil War story is written in the ink of casualty lists and the dust of battlefields, but there are chapters that remain unread, tucked away in the Appalachian's silent, suffocating depths. The mountains do not care for men's causes, nor do they recognize generals' borders. They are a realm of ancient stone and eternal shadow, where the Watcher remains patient and unblinking, waiting for the next group of wanderers to stray too far from the path. As the wind howls through the high ridges tonight, it carries 1,865's echoes, a reminder that the wilderness never truly forgets those who dare to trespass within its heart. Some secrets are meant to stay buried in the mist, where the only witness is the cold, indifferent eye of the peaks.